So, yesterday I rewatched the 1999 film Inspector Gadget, which is directed by the world-famous David Kellogg, who mostly directed commercials, I think. It stars Matthew Broderick and Rupert Everett. It's got a whopping 4.2 on IMDb, and I'm not really sure why I watched it, but it ended up being an extremely interesting movie. This isn't really a review, but it's some of my thoughts about this movie. Inspector Gadget, I watched as a kid, the movie, but it was originally an animated kids cartoon with Inspector Gadget being voiced by Don Adams. We'll come back to that, but basically it's about sort of a derpy comedic police inspector person who has all these gadgets built into his body that he more or less can use to help track down criminals, particularly this one organization called MAD, led by Dr. Claw. The movie takes some of those ideas and leaves others behind. It opens with a dream scene from Matthew Broderick's character in which he saves a bunch of young kids from a car crash. This is a bit ironic if you know anything about Matthew Broderick's personal history with cars and killing people using them. But in general, this adaptation follows a pattern that a lot of adaptations of sort of shorter form things like television shows follow, where the television show is sort of a serial. The Simpsons movie maybe did something like this too, to some extent. You've got this sort of serial format where everything's going to sort of go back to the beginning at the end of each episode, and you want to turn that into a big movie that has a much broader scope and that has more depth for characters. Well, the backstory is one approach to fleshing this all out. So you talk about the origin of the story. Like I said, this movie starts with a dream in which Matthew Broderick is dreaming of saving kids one day. He isn't doing it currently because he's not a cop. Instead, he's a lowly he's a lowly security guard, which is pretty interesting. This movie starts out with some fairly blatant police fetishism, basically. But before we get to that, worth mentioning this character of Penny, the niece. It's in the television show as well. There's Penny and Brain, her dog. Brain doesn't play a very big role in the movie, but he's there. Penny, as much as the movie goes to the backstory and tells you the story of how this security guard becomes RoboCop, it doesn't really give us any information about what the heck the niece is doing. Or why she's so close to her uncle. It's not clear who her parents are or why she spends so much time with him. But the movie opens with a nice sort of interaction there with her rooting for him to become a cop, and Matthew Broderick, Inspector Gadget, the future Inspector Gadget, not wanting John Brown is his name, by the way, which is this coincidence, John Brown with the abolitionist John Brown? Maybe, don't know. But the... He's hesitant to come to her school to do the career day, basically, because he's only a security guard, and all he can hope to aspire to is being a cop. Like I said, we've got the police fetish here. They invoke the old to serve and protect as the ultimate goal in life. And to be fair, this is a kids' movie, but, kids' movies matter and set out ideas, that kids will grow up with and have in their lives for quite a while. And I am not gonna, this is not, I'm not interested in sort of a moral tirade against this movie, but it is interesting how it is invested in a Manichaean view, basically, of cops and criminals. One that has never been borne out in reality, but that especially now we're seeing is complicated. And I only bring this up really, again, this is not sort of a moral, I do have moral qualms with this movie, but that's not what this is about. But I think that it's important, showing how black and white the views of criminality and the law and government are in this movie. I think that ties in with a lot of the considerations we have about technology that arise later in the movie. So it's important to think about that to some extent, where now we're seeing this model of the good versus evil being totally eroded and certainly not mapping onto police and criminals anymore, if it ever did. But this was something that media long perpetuated, and that this movie does as well, although there's some interesting asterisks coming up. The most important thing about this movie by far, and the most interesting thing without a doubt, is that it's about cyborgs. And cyborgs are extremely complicated entities in film. There's tons and tons and tons of movies about cyborgs going back a long way. You look at Metropolis, for instance, with the enthralling cyborg woman. In that movie, you look at Blade Runner, The Terminator. There are countless examples of cyborgs, and usually they're sort of portrayed as basically the ultimate extreme of modernity, right? So through modernity, our lives are shaped. We get more and more tools. We get more and more convenience. We get ways to remake our bodies with the rise of hygiene and such, which is a surprisingly interesting topic. You look at some of sort of the national hygienic programs in countries like France, or something of the introductions of public pools, right? Modernity leads to cleanliness, leads to multiple brands of soap and such, about remaking oneself for convenience and for the projection of some sort of external image based around values that we now take for granted, like being clean. The cyborg is the enmeshing of technology within our actual flesh, right? It is, like I say, the ultimate extreme of modernity, where no longer are we looking at the screen, but in fact our brains are, have the screen directly wired into them. So the cyborg partly might be seen as something in the distant future, but there's a lot of movies that also will sort of insinuate that we're actually already there, right? That the time we spend looking at screens and such has already turned us into some kind of cyborg. Inspector Gadget is sort of a complex twist on this. But like I said, the cyborg thing is very potent. With Inspector Gadget, you've got this idea of gadgets. And to me, the thing that maybe the gadget inspires first is the thought of a toy, right? And the first thing I think actually is of when I was like in elementary school and we had these things called like book orders, which maybe you may or may not be familiar with, but this would be like a catalog where you could order books ostensibly, but also there were some toys every time, and that's what most people would sort of be interested in, was getting the sort of cheap toys from book orders. They'd be like little spy gadgets or things like this. What is the line between holding the gadget in your hand and having the gadget actually be part of your hand? Both of them are some sort of extension of you. There's some sort of cool factor to holding the gadget that surely would just be extended by the gadget being actually built in. But at the same time, holding the gadget to some extent, there is part of the gadget being built into your personality and your identity in the way that you're going to think about the world. So like I said, a lot of literal cyborgs in movies have sort of a metaphorical value for the way that we already interact with technology and shape ourselves through it. One of the reasons, potentially, that Inspector Gadget, the movie, made money, even though the producers were originally pretty worried about it. In fact, after some test screenings, they cut the movie down from like 110 minutes to like 75 minutes or something like that. So they cut like almost more than half an hour out of the movie because they thought it was not looking so good. But they didn't have a whole lot of options for kids' movies in 1999, and so they showed it anyway, and it actually ended up making money. And one reason that this could be is because it had a big tie-in with McDonald's. And I don't know the details here, but basically it's some sort of Happy Meal toy type thing where you could get like Gadget figurines with your meal. And here, I was just talking about toys and book orders. Well, the Gadget is inherently linked to that in the figurative manner, but also in the totally literal way that the movie had this promotional campaign with McDonald's that explicitly tied gadgets to Inspector Gadget to toys. That's interesting. So the exact details of Inspector Gadget as a cyborg are kind of interesting. A lot of the times when we see cyborgs in movies, they fall into a couple different categories, and this will be a non-exhaustive list, but here's some ideas. One of them is the unstoppable cyborg, right? So this is in sort of the movie that is looking at the anxiety of modernity and is worrying about some of the things that I've touched on, about how technology has extended ourselves and has encroached onto the body. And here you have a movie like Terminator or something where you have the unstoppable force of the cyborg. And these are just like all powerful. There's nothing we can do about it. They don't seem to obey physics. They don't obey any of the properties of the flesh that we're known to, right? Bullets bounce off, for instance. And here there's an incredible sort of mechanical strength to it, but there's also a huge anxiety about the unstoppable force of the cyborg. Blade Runner has sort of a much more subtle version of this. This movie, Inspector Gadget, has some interesting references to Blade Runner, including a zoom and enhance Gadget at one point, and some flips that I'll talk about later. There also in the movie is a period where there's the bad Gadget. I will be spoiling parts of this movie, by the way. I hope that's okay. But at one point, the bad guy, Claw, is able to make an evil cyborg basically called Bad Gadget, who looks a lot like Inspector Gadget, but slightly less human, slightly less real. He's got different teeth, for instance, that look a bit more fake. He goes and wreaks havoc on the town. There's basically nothing they can do about that. So this gives us the unstoppable cyborg. Another category worth mentioning is the seductive cyborg, right? So you mentioned Metropolis. Blade Runner 2 also has this. And interestingly, Inspector Gadget 2, which I haven't seen since I saw it as a kid, which was, I think, a direct-to-video movie that has horrible special effects and isn't any good, has a seductive cyborg in it, which is sort of interesting. But Inspector Gadget doesn't really fall into either of those categories. He is more what I would call the government cyborg, right? He has gadgets that are kind of derpy. They have glitches. Some of them, it's unclear why you would need these things or why they would be useful, or something like that. And it's a little bit hard to understand this in the context of the cyborg, but it's fairly easy to understand the historical context of how this type of role came to be. And it follows from the television show and from like the kids' cartoon and from some of the TV shows that this was based on. So let's work backwards, or let's work forwards, starting with James Bond. So James Bond gives you one very potent view of modernism, right? Through gadgets. You go to visit Q, and you always have the new stuff. And in some ways, there's this connection between James Bond and like a Sky Mall catalog, right? All this sort of the useless gadgets of the world, but things that feel like the future and whatnot. It's such an interesting topic to think about, sort of the commercialization of the future, right? And how people sell things that have sort of the tinge of the future to them. Obviously, the future has not arisen yet, and yet still people will pay money to buy it and to participate in it, even when these objects might have sort of nominal actual use value. And so a lot of these sort of gadgets, like the James Bond gadgets, naturally already kind of border on absurd, right? And the James Bond franchise has varied a lot over the years. Some films are much more serious than others, and sometimes the gadgets are played pretty straight, and other times maybe there is a little bit of a satire already built into James Bond about these gadgets that kind of make sense, but not really, and about a particular view of the future. Okay, either way, in the 60s, there arose sort of a genre of spy-fi that sort of took this James Bond type gadget thing to an extreme, and really went in on like spies with gadgets and such, or spies on spaceships, or things like that. And there's a bunch of different shows that did this, but you take one more step from this and you get the show Get Smart, which pretty interesting television show that stars Don Adams as Secret Agent 86, Barbara Feldon as 99. And this is a movie that is basically a spoof of spy-fi. So here, the gadgets are being made fun of, and Maxwell Smart has all these really goofy gadgets that really don't make any sense. They try to do, they're trying to put stuff together, and it sort of, nothing really pans out or works, basically. But they end up sort of solving the cases by chance, usually, if not through competence, and certainly not because of their gadgets. So that's a whirlwind of different perspectives on the gadgets, and at least we can take from this that people maybe don't know exactly what to make about gadgets and the modern world and technology and our relationship to it, and also its relationship to power. Like I said, this Manichaean police fetishism is significant here because these gadgets play a role in policing and in power, right? And the thing with these television shows to keep in mind is that these are all sort of Cold War era. That's the thing that sort of highlights the spy aspect of it. And the sort of serious shows are maybe talking about Cold War anxiety, and the less serious shows are lampooning it. And so there's disagreement about how much we should care about that, and there's disagreement about how much we should maybe be worried about our own government to some extent, right? When you have the secret agents in government with tons of power and tons of gadgets, there's maybe some worry about that. But more comedic shows like Get Smart have sort of this government incompetence angle to them, which is pretty interesting. Okay, what's the link to Inspector Gadget? Well, my theory is that Inspector Gadget basically is Get Smart, but for kids. Don Adams, who played Maxwell Smart, voices Inspector Gadget. Now, that's not necessarily indicative of anything, but the themes of the show are pretty similar. And you have sort of a government. Yeah, you have a government spy who is incompetent, perhaps in a very stereotypically government-like way. Some people would say that. At least. This gives you another spin, basically, on the cyborgs as sort of a bungler. And this is one of the reasons why, to some extent, I should say the difference between maybe Get Smart and, the difference between Get Smart and Inspector Gadget is that the gadgets are now internalized. They're just part of Inspector Gadget. It becomes a total identity of the show, is that it's about gadgetry, whereas Get Smart's it's a component of it, and such, whatever. How do we map this idea of the bungler, the bungling cyborg, the bungling government cyborg onto the more traditional views of cyborg as seductive or dangerous? It's kind of tricky. But the movie actually gives us some handrails into how we can understand this. And that's interesting. Gadget is an interesting hero in the movie because he isn't competent, right? And normally the good guys are good at stuff. But here, not so much. So what is the virtue that makes Matthew Broderick, that makes John Brown the protagonist of the movie if it's not his technical competence? Well, it's his heart, basically. It's what he feels for. And again, we come to the simplified moral principles of the movie in the wanting to serve and protect. Just wanting to do the right thing and boiling that down into being a police officer. This is what makes... like I said, this is what makes John Brown the protagonist, is that he has these ideas, or this is what makes him suitable to be a protagonist. And there's some specifics of the technology that also go into this. So there's an interesting line in the beginning of the movie when Dr. I forget her name, but Brenda, whatever her name is trying to, with her father, is trying to make the foot move. Bradford, I think, Brenda Bradford, that could be right. Is trying to make the foot move. And this is one of their early experiments in cybernetics, where they try to power a foot with a brain. So her dad tries to make the foot kick, basically, just by thinking about it. And at first, he has a lot of trouble just thinking about it, trying to get the foot to move or do anything. And then it turns out that when he's having sort of a happier memory, thinking about his wife, the foot moves, and Brenda exclaims, "Oh, we've discovered it. It's powered by the will, not by the thought. The heart, not the mind." And this is an extremely interesting maneuver that the movie takes, because it's saying, look, not only is John Brown a good guy because he is has these virtues. He's immoral. He's a good person because he wants to be a cop, right? Not only is he a good guy, but he's actually perfectly suited to technology. To our new technology, because our new technology, guess what? It happens to look for people who are good guys, people who have emotional strengths, people who can build an intuitive connection to the machine. And this is actually taken all the way at one point when this all-important chip that makes everything work gets stolen from Inspector Gadget. But it turns out that, in fact, he doesn't even need it, right? Because he's such a good guy. That in fact he can control all the electronics just from his sheer goodwill and from the power of his heart. Of course, this makes no sense, but this is such an interesting bridge that's being built here, such an interesting connection where we're taking the Sky Mall like gadgets, these haphazard things that may or may not work, and we're building some emotional connection to it, right? We're building some sort of bridge between our hearts and the gadgets, and we're providing with this some blueprint to productive life in a technical world, in a world where we are all partly cyborgs. And when we interact with cybernetics, when we've got our phones attached to our hands and attached to our eyes, basically, right? So the phone clearly is the new toy, basically. And this movie came out in 1999, but it's sort of it's quite interesting how it's looking at this. Now, you talk about hands and phones. Well, there's a great line in this movie when Claw is looking at his claw. So his hand gets crushed. There's the bad guy, who, interestingly, the bad guy here is part of, he's the head of Skolex Industries, right? So this is the sort of big business, mad inventor type, right? So it's interesting that at the end of the day here, big business should actually be sort of the bad guys, which is a very Disney-esque kind of line, probably, basically extended all the way from like Frank Capra populism. So they try and sort of go in on that. Too, but there's a great line, point is, when Skolex is first checking out his claw, when he says, it's like a postmodern Captain Hook, right? So this is a character who has just the hand is remade with the claw, presumably, seemingly foreseeing the cell phone in the claw. It's also, what an interesting line, that it's the postmodern Captain Hook. Very interesting. Of course, this guy's a big businessman, not a pirate, so to speak. That invokes such another really interesting sort of line of thought about piracy, right, and about anti-heroes and such. So sometimes you get pirates are the bad guys, like Captain Hook is the bad guy, but in other times pirates are more like Robin Hood-esque characters, and you see like the Pirates of the Caribbean, which is not the first thing to do this, but you get like Errol Flynn and such, where it might be a romantic pirate who's actually, sort of a Robin Hood extra social figure. Either way, I won't get too distracted by the pirates, but that one line, postmodern Captain Hook, extremely interesting. So, like I said, Inspector Gadget maybe gives us a blueprint for a way that we can live in a technologically embodied world where we have kind of haphazard gadgets. And the answer is basically to be pure of heart. And now maybe you see that and you think, hey, that's pretty cool. Like, that's actually maybe something productive that gives us information. On the other hand, you might say that's the ultimate deception, right? Thinking that if you're pure of heart, then actually all this technology around us will be fine and you'll have a productive connection to it. That overlooks the sort of systemic power dynamics of technological systems, which we're seeing now as big business of Facebook and Google and whatnot, being able to shape your life and your thinking. And it doesn't really matter if you go into it as a good guy or not. They influence your behavior and your thought patterns and such. So the movie sort of can go two ways there. Either being sort of, hey, a nice reminder to be nice on the internet, or an illusion that, in fact, your personality matters when you are subjected to the internet. Pretty interesting. So, like I said, that's sort of the main thing about Inspector Gadget is it's a very particular brand of cyborgism that comes pretty close to some things, right? For instance, we have RoboCop. The movie is in very similar territory to this, but in RoboCop, the guy, I forget his name, who gets turned into the cop, basically loses his autonomy and then has to win it back. Inspector Gadget, John Brown keeps his autonomy, but has to sort of win technical competence, basically, and has to sort of learn the controls to some extent. So there, in some ways, the plots sort of go opposite directions. But that's the cyborg angle. There's a bunch of other interesting things about this movie. For instance, the car. Let me ask. This is just such an interesting question about this movie. Is why the heck is the car black in the movie? What do I mean? Well, so there's the Gadget-mobile, and the Gadget-mobile has some precedent in the cartoon, although I don't think it's a major player in the cartoon, but it's in the intro at least. I have not seen very much of this cartoon, but I've seen some of it. In some ways, actually, the Gadget-mobile in the movie is more impressive than Inspector Gadget himself. It's a self-driving car, interesting, right? So we've got self-driving cars here, and there's a certain anxiety about self-driving cars now. Now, of course, self-driving cars weren't really a technology yet in the late 90s that was being talked of, but still the idea of the car being able to drive itself is an interesting milestone. And also there's precedent for things like Knight Rider, of course. But it's an interesting precedent for taking the human out of the loop and for the total sort of modern system, right, where the car drives itself. Of course, we also have the lineage of the American romance with the car, right? So like I said, you have Knight Rider and you have all these things where it's like, why do secret agents always need cars, right? In Get Smart, he's got his Sunburst, whatever it's called. He's got his red car, changes for the 5th season, I think. Anyway, but so the car already is like a pretty interesting thing here because, like I said, potentially more complicated, more impressive than Gadget himself, and touching on some very fertile ground in America, which is the idea of the car. But things get even more interesting when he gets into the car, and the car has a personality, and the car's black, right? Which is pretty interesting. They have some black comedian reading all the lines to it, and he's got attitude, or he's spunky, or something like this, in the most sort of bland Disney way possible. And I honestly don't really know what to make of this. On the surface, it seems just like very basic sort of co-option of hip-hop. right? So late 90s, Disney's basically trying to cash in on this, but at the same time, it's a particularly friendly vision of this. So they're trying to remake hip-hop for kids, basically the friendly, marketable version of hip-hop, right? Of course, this is what Disney and big companies do, watering things down until it's just the image, the thing that's most reproducible and marketable. So maybe the car is taking place in that. At the same time, you have to wonder something about the chauffeur, right? The black car and the black driver or something have a particularly interesting history in America and are linked to this kind of idea of servitude to some extent, which is interesting. And then on top of that, you also have to throw in the themes of criminality in the movie and wonder if there's some sort of weird stereotypical logic going on here. They're either trying to sort of counterspin some sort of like gang stereotypes or something like that by having a like hip black crime fighting car. Like I said, I don't really know what to make of this, but it's an interesting question if you happen to see this movie. Another thing that's pretty interesting about this movie is the role of femininity in the movie. You get the doctor, Brenda Bradford, I guess, who's a woman mainly talked about for being attractive. And you have a mayor, the mayor of Riverton, which is where this movie is set, although it's actually filmed in, I can't remember where, like Kansas City or somewhere. But the mayor basically is extremely ditzy, something that wouldn't fly now that we actually care about having women be represented in government and in business and such. You wouldn't have this really over-the-top, incompetent and sort of conniving mayor, which is an interesting role. And then another kind of interesting thing is at one point, Claw, and this probably pertains to some parts that were cut out of the movie because this element doesn't really make any sense how he's doing this or why. But at one point, it's implied that Claw has sort of started building his own. Well, so he builds the bad version of Gadget, but he also builds sort of a bad version of Brenda Bradford, I guess. Like I said, this part seems really heavily edited because it makes no sense. But the real Brenda runs into the bad Brenda at one point at work. It's sort of an interesting scene. And the bad Brenda basically informs the real one that they're very similar, except that the bad one is more attractive and smarter or something like that. And here again we have the cyborg mirror basically going on here, which is an interesting idea, right? If someone were to make sort of a robot version of you that was bad, what would it end up looking like, and what could we learn about our ideas of technology and overall morals by thinking about the bad version of you? One of the things that's pretty interesting about the bad version of Brenda is that it's a hyper feminine character. And she's a cheerleader basically and starts like dancing around and cheering and doing a bunch of like handsprings and flips, which is almost certainly a reference to the character of Pris in Blade Runner. And that character, interestingly, is actually a pretty cool and, well, a very interesting view of sort of femininity. Pris's sort of femininity, kind of very disaffected, and putting on a feminine thing in order to trick JG, the robot designer guy. But ultimately, Pris is like wearing a wig and such and doesn't seem attached to any of these ideas. So here, the cheerleading version of Brenda is kind of the opposite of that, and is basically just like a ditzy sorority version of Brenda, which is sort of particularly interesting given that Brenda is actually seen as like sort of a interesting scientist character, and you wonder what the heck if they're trying to imply anything like with this, or if it's just a simple contrast or something like this. But this cheerleader ends up flipping off the side of the building and presumably dies and is not in the movie again. Like I said, this part seems sort of heavily edited. So overall, though, there's some interesting moments in terms of femininity in the movie and how those tie into technology and governance. There's also a sort of interesting, conspicuous moment about obesity in the film. So Claw, I guess, went to school. What's his name? Sanford Skolex, I think is the character's name. Went to school, Harvard, with Brenda. and they meet at some party, and Skolex says, "Hey, do you remember me? We went to school together." She says, "No." He says, "Well, you probably don't recognize me because I was obese, but maybe you remember this." And he like blows up his face really big to like mimic what he used to look like or something like that. And she says, "Oh yeah, I do recognize you." And later in the movie, when towards the end, when Brenda sort of finally sees through Skolex, realizes he's the bad guy, which you would think she would have realized earlier, but whatever, kids movie. She says, "You know what? I liked you better when you were fat." And Skolex says, "Oh, well, bring on the donuts. Bring on the cake. I will binge," or something like that. Which, like I said, it's sort of just this conspicuous undercurrent with obesity in the film that I really don't know what to make of. And again, I mean, there's other ties here to technology, again, right? So this guy, Skolex, played by Rupert Everett. Also, worth mentioning that Rupert Everett is sort of a prominently gay actor. I mean, I don't know if I think it's maybe a bit of a stretch to tie that into here. But it's interesting to think about. And the character, this hyper-masculine character he's playing, does have maybe a bit of flamboyance to it as well. And that's another interesting sort of counterspin, another interesting aspect of the movie. But right, point is obesity versus the cyborg, right? Those things are sort of incompatible, right? A fat robot, that doesn't really make any sense. And Skolex, in some ways, Skolex kind of has the sort of idea, reminiscent of Christian Bale in American Psycho or something like that, right? Which in some ways you would wonder if he already is a cyborg, basically, even though it's only his hand that's actually made out of metal. But you look at, so not only could there not be an obese cyborg, but if we're using the cyborg sort of as the metaphor for ourselves already entrapped in the technological culture or whatever, then obesity has no place there. And like I said, when you look at the sort of hyper-masculine American Psycho-esque character, well, there's no way that character could be overweight and such. Now, it's really hard to know how the heck this is supposed to tie into some overall moral arc of the movie. Like, is this a Disney film telling kids, like, hey, it's bad to be fat or something? Let me remind you, they had a McDonald's promotion hooked into this movie. Or is this just a, aimless joke against the bad guy? I don't know. I think overall what it comes down to is that some of the movies that are most complicated and interesting aren't the movies that are deliberately created by auteurs, but they're the movies that are haphazardly created by companies, where a lot of weird different elements get thrown in, and where you get like cinematic references, like these references to Blade Runner, or you also in this movie have a reference to Citizen Kane, where Skolex is sitting in a very Kane-like office behind in front of an enormous picture of himself, right? And you invoke Citizen Kane into this, and already you have a ton of other angles to come at the movie from. And I mean, like I said, the one little throwaway line about the postmodern Captain Hook, well, that brings in a lot of interesting stuff about piracy. And overall, I don't think any of this is deliberate so much as it's just sort of lines that found their way into the script through this movie that was made by a huge coalition of random people who may or may not have been passionate about, making this random kids movie. And the product of this all is an extremely complicated and interesting movie. I don't have a lot of answers about many of these things, but hopefully this might introduce some things to think about. And if you happen to watch this movie, I will say as a final note that I actually think the 4.2 rating of this movie is a bit harsh. And not just because the movie is sort of accidentally interesting, but I do think there are moments of love and care shown in the production. There are also some decent jokes in the movie. I think there are some kind of funny moments. The plot isn't good, but whatever. There are also some pretty funny moments of, like, Penny, for instance, listening to All Star by Smash Mouth, I guess, in the car. Is this before Shrek? 1999? It's around that time. I think it's before. And prominent Tommy Hilfiger jean jacket product placement. So there are all kinds of goofy moments like that. But I think there are also a couple of nice moments, like these cinematic references, or two really nice scenes. I think, honestly, the two best scenes in the entire movie are both post-credit scenes, which is pretty funny. The first one shows Sykes, who's the minion, before Minions meant something a bit more specific. He's the minion to Claw, or the former minion to Claw, that Penny convinces to defect. And he goes to a minion support group that has Richard Kiel, like the actual guy who plays, I forget his name, but the guy from the multiple James Bond movies, like Moonraker. He's in Moonraker, and he's in the one before Moonraker, whatever that is, with the gold teeth. It's also got somebody who's supposed to be... Well, actually, I tell you what. It's interesting just to look at the scene and see if you can name who all the people are supposed to be. I think I know most of them, maybe. And with a couple of them, it seems like they actually got the real actors. I don't think they did with everyone, but I'm not certain. That's a really interesting moment. It's too bad that it got relegated to a post-credit scene. And then the second post-credit scene has Brain, the dog, answering his little watch phone thing, which is a throwback to the cartoon. And Brain speaks with a human voice, voiced by none other than Dawn Addams. So it does seem like there's some care and attention in this movie, and a lot of interesting themes when you look at the kids' version of RoboCop, that is Inspector Gadget.